tell us when you actually started out, because you started out like me, actually, in the regions.
Absolutely, yes, in BBC Plymouth in the southwest, for Devon, Cornwall, bits of Somerset and Dorset. I'd done my a 3-year apprenticeship as a journalist and photographer, because in those days you didn't go to telly, to university to do a degree in media. I did 2 years in photography and 3 years the National Union of Journalists training scheme on a newspaper, and I was indentured to that paper for 3 years.
And what were you actually doing on the paper?
I was working. I was doing any story that they sent me out to do. At the same time as doing a degree in law and in politics and learning how to do shorthand and typing. But I mean, it was wonderful because it was a small regional newspaper that produced a Sunday paper and 2 weekly papers. And I started on the daily paper in the photographic department, which was super. But then as a journalist, 3 papers a week we were producing. And it meant that I was the rugby correspondent at one point because there was nobody. I was at the time going out with a guy who eventually became my husband, who played rugby, and I knew the rules and nobody else did. So they let me be the rugby correspondent. But I was doing all sorts of stuff, and I was taking my own photographs, and they were being used in the paper. So I was being a photojournalist, which is what I wanted to do. And I had a feature every week in the paper, but I was learning my job as a journalist. And I remember on my first day, the editor then, a man called Mr. Wilfred Cox, who called me in and he said, Angela, you're going to learn an awful lot in the next 3 years with us. He said, but I want you always to remember in your career 3 words: accuracy, honesty, and integrity. And if you can apply those 3 words to your work as a journalist, you won't go far wrong. That was how I started. And because I had bylines, the editor of television news in the West Country rang me up and said, would you like to come and talk to us? And I went up and saw them. I was 6 months to the end of my apprenticeship.
So what year is this?
This would have been in 1966. I'm sorry, 1966. He said, come and talk to us. So I did. I did an audition. He said, would you like to come and do some work for us? And so on my day off from the newspaper, I did my very, very, very first broadcast on the 5th of September 1966, and the first words that I uttered on television, live television from Plymouth, was, oysters are about to become big business for salt ash. And I know that because I kept the script, and I kept the contract, and I know that the BBC paid me for the film that I made and my television appearance the vast sum of £6.10. I suppose they trusted me because I'd done my apprenticeship, so I knew about pictures because I'd been taking photographs since I was 5. So I knew photography, and I knew about journalism, so I knew how to write a story and do an interview. But I had no experience at all in front of the camera, and I do remember after I got home that night, I said to my dad, you know, what did you think, Daddy? And he said, oh, it was fine. He said, but you look like a rabbit caught in the headlights. And I said, but
I looked like that for years, honestly.
But I said, Daddy, you know, I'm used to being an anonymous newspaper reporter, but now there are people watching me at work, which is exactly what you said. And my father, who was a Royal Marine and an engineer, nothing to do with broadcasting at all, my dad very wisely said to me, well, the next time you go in the studio, when you look at the camera, talk to me. And he was so wise in saying, and I say now, I'm a visiting professor of journalism at Lincoln University, and when I speak to my students there, I say, I've spent 50 plus years now talking to my father, because that's what we communicate, that's what we do, isn't it? And aren't the regions a wonderful place to learn your job? But the thing, why I think regions were a wonderful place for anybody in television to work is because you're able to sit with experts. I sat with engineers, sound engineers, and listened to them playing and seeing what they were doing and knowing how it would work. And when I started filming, again, I had a wonderful cameraman called Colin Rowe, who was my very, very first film when I went out, you know, telling me how to do noddies and, you know, learning all of those things. And the controller of the television in the West Country was a man called, Salmon. I've forgotten his first name. Not Peter Salmon, that came years later. But a wonderful guy who was Cornish. And he was the most wonderful, wonderful broadcaster. And at the end of a week, he would call me in and say, you know, why did you say that on a particular film? Or wouldn't it have been better if you'd done this? Or I liked when you did that. And Tom Salmon. And Tom Salmon was my mentor. And he taught me. And I feel I learned how I knew about pictures and words and writing and interviewing. But to learn how to be a communicator and a broadcaster, I learnt by watching other people and actually being mentored by Tom Salmon. And you could only do that in the
What
regions.
I want to know is, you started out and you say you were in papers in Plymouth and then you went on to television. I mean, just that there were not many women doing that at the time. Not in the 1964. You must have been one of the very few to be trained and be training as a journalist.
Yes.
How many other women were doing it, in the papers when you first started out in regional telly?
Sheila Kennedy used to come down to the West Country. Some people may remember Sheila's name. Sheila Kennedy was an announcer, and she was the only other person I ever came across who was a woman doing the job that I was doing. It was unusual.
And how was it? And what was it like then? I mean, you must have had extraordinary confidence to be able to go into that, because we've got, we won't do it quite yet, but we've got some photographs of newsrooms of all, and it was just all men.
You must find this, Sophie. If you know you can do the job, people respect the fact that you can do the job. And so when I was headhunted by the local ITV station, Westwood Television at the time, and when I went there, again, I was the only woman who was on air as a reporter, on air as a producer-director and an editor of my own series on Westwood Television. And it was very interesting. I was making a documentary at the Dartmouth Royal Naval College with an all-male crew and one woman who was my PA. And we were having dinner in the wardroom one evening because we were at the college for a very long time. And someone covered in a lot of, gold braid and spaghetti came into the wardroom and sort of said, who's in charge here? And my cameraman, who was a man in his 50s then, and the sound recorders, they turned and they said, she is, and I was 26. And so I've always said I think I was very lucky, because at that time in the 60s, there was not the same sort of box ticking that went on later, where people felt they had to have a woman. You had to, tick a box and say, we better have a woman, because women were going on burning their bras and talking about equality. I was doing the job, and I think because I proved I could do it, I got their respect. And so I always feel I was very lucky that it wasn't until I came here to Television News that then I became aware that I was just one woman in an all-male newsroom, and there were one or two occasions where things happened that made me realise that the men were not too comfortable having a woman around. But that apart, I always feel that I was very lucky that I was kind of almost ahead of the wave.
Okay, well, let's at that very point, let's watch they've got little clips of you and me actually, doing the job. But it's great to see.
Take it away.
Good evening. Indeed, the voters have made their choice. Mrs. Thatcher will lead Britain into the 80s.
After 20 years, the Americans are out of Vietnam.
Iraq is claiming more big gains against Iran in the Gulf War. Painstaking search of the rubble produces its reward, the rescue of a 2-month-old baby girl.
Private and public celebration is held to mark the birth of a son.
Down there lie some of the most beautiful stalactite and stalagmite formations in the country.
I keep looking at the clothes.
In mitigation, can I say that picture of me going down the cave was for BBC Plymouth or BBC South West.
When was that? What year was that?
That would have been 1966, 67. So we are talking about a very long time, more than 50 years ago, when beehives were all the rage. So even though I was
very glamorous,
though I was crawling through this, a pipe about this big to get into this cave, I still had the hair, darling.
Hair and makeup, very important.